As you begin Nonsense on Stilts, a discussion of pseudoscience probably ought to start with Popper's demarcation problem. And so let me ask, what at first blush distinguishes science from everything else, and then more particularly from pseudoscience? Though, of course, we'll find some more nuances here.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's not an easy one. Yeah, you're right. Any discussion like that probably should start with Popper, although that question has been around for quite a while. As far as I know, it was Socrates, of all people, who raised the issue of what we call the demarcation problem, the distinction between science and pseudoscience. Actually, what Popper called the demarcation problem. In a Platonic dialogue entitled The Charmides, Socrates at some point asks, what is the difference between a quack and a doctor, and how do we tell? And at the end, he says, the only way to tell is if you're actually yourself a doctor. In other words, if you're an expert, then you're going to be able to tell. But the rest of us are gonna have a hard time because quacks sound very much like doctors. And so that question has been around for a while. Popper was the first one in modern times to sort of make it the centerpiece of research in what we call philosophy of science these days. And he thought he had arrived at a very neat solution. He thought that if a theory or a statement can be falsified, it is scientific. If it cannot be falsified, it's non-scientific and more likely than not pseudoscience. What does that mean? So falsification is the at least theoretical possibility that if you claim something, that there has to be a way to verify, to say, okay, is this actually not true? And to confirm that in fact it's not true. So the falsifiability means that there has to be a possibility to show that a statement is false if it is in fact false. So for instance, if I were to say, right now I'm wearing a blue shirt, that statement is falsifiable, and in fact, it is false. The color of my shirt is not blue, and you can see that through the screen. So that's not a pseudoscientific statement. But if I were to say that I'm wearing an invisible shirt that cannot be touched, cannot be analyzed chemically, doesn't reflect life, doesn't weigh anything, and so on and so forth, now that statement is unfalsifiable. Right? There's no way that you could possibly prove that that statement is false. Notice also that Popper put the emphasis on falsifiability, not verifiability. That is, he didn't think that to verify a statement, to come up with empirical evidence in favor of a statement was particularly important, because it's too easy to come up with reasons to believe in things, or for evidence that apparently it's sustaining or at least not contradicting a particular notion. It's only when you get to the point of being able to show that something is in fact false that you made progress. One way to understand this is that Popper thought that science makes progress not by confirming theories, not by accepting theories as true, but by eliminating theories that don't work. So we don't know, for instance, whether general relativity is true. We just know that it works well enough. There's a lot of empirical, verification of it, but we don't know whether it's true or not. What we do know is that Newtonian mechanics is false, and that's because we have empirical evidence showing that some things that the theory predicts are actually not the case, and therefore the theory must be false. So that was great. In theory, like he had solved the problems. Like not only he had given a very good definition of science, but he had also, by implication, come up with a definition of pseudoscience. The problem is that it doesn't work. That is, the criterion of falsifiability is actually not very apt to solve the problem of demarcation. Why? Well, for instance, there are several pseudoscientific statements or constructions or theories that are in fact falsifiable. Let's take flood geology, which is a type of creationist statement about the age of the Earth. So according to flat geology, all the major geological formations in the world, including the Grand Canyon, were were formed at once, very suddenly and very recently, 6,000 years ago, by, of course, a worldwide flood. Well, anybody who knows anything about geology will tell you that that statement is in fact false. It doesn't go with anything else that we know, excuse me, about either physics or geology. So that statement sounds like a scientific statement, but in fact it's false. So it is pseudoscience, but it is falsifiable. And in fact, we know it to be false. So Popper was incorrect that everything that is not falsifiable is in fact not science. And it gets worse. There are some scientific theories that are non-falsifiable, at least for certain long periods of time, and yet nobody thinks that they're pseudoscience. For instance, string theory in physics, right? So string theory is supposed to be, or has been promoted for the last several decades, as the next big thing in fundamental physics. It's supposed to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity. But it's unfalsifiable. It makes no, all the novel predictions that it makes are actually not empirically testable. The only ones that are empirically testable are predictions that we already know about, and that are made also by either quantum mechanics or general relativity. So at the moment, string theory is unfalsifiable, but nobody in his right mind thinks of it as pseudoscience. And so there goes the Popperian approach. It doesn't work. What modern, contemporary philosophers of science seem to agree on is that there is no simple definition. There's no simple demarcation line between science and pseudoscience. It's a complex landscape. And it's a landscape that is defined by how complex and sophisticated the theory is, how well the theory matches the empirical evidence that is available, and a number of other criteria. So there is not a simple, small number of criteria that would separate science from pseudoscience. Some cases are obvious. Fundamental physics is a science, and creationism is a pseudoscience. Those are pretty clear. Others, perhaps more interestingly, are kind of borderline. So, for instance, is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence science or pseudoscience? Well, that's a good question. It is done usually by scientists using things, scientific instruments like radio telescopes. And yet it has been going on for 70 years with not a single data point in its favor. We don't have any data at all about intelligence, other intelligent civilizations in the galaxy. So I could say, well, that's a funny science. It's a science with no data. Maybe it's not a science after all. Or you could, I mentioned earlier, things like telepathy. Telepathy for a long time was on the borderlines, because for over a century, people had done research in university departments at Duke, for instance, and at Princeton, on the possibility of telepathy. And for a long time, the thing was kind of borderline. It seemed like there was some kind of evidence for it, but it wasn't that compelling. At this point, I think we're done. My judgment is that no, telepathy is just not a thing, and there is no that conclusion isn't likely to change. But it is certainly far closer. The field is far closer to actual science than, let's say, creationism or astrology or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, returning for a moment to the first thing you said, Socrates' question, what is the difference between a quack and a doctor, is still very topical and pressing today. Maybe we'll get to the difficulty of selecting experts. But a further dimension of this unfalsifiability is unfalsifiability. I found it quite fascinating that Marxism and psychoanalysis, two theories that you mentioned in Nonsense on Stilts, and that I think Popper also referred to, are precluded from being science because they are simply too powerful in that they can accommodate any new evidence, and just they're hydratic in a sense. Maybe in a similar way to string theory, I've heard this before, is that if string theory just has many different heads. If there's a dead end, a new one will spring up and accommodate the new.
That's right.
Evidence.
Yeah, that was an interesting insight that Popper had. That his point there was, if a theory explains everything, then it doesn't really explain anything. If every conceivable data that can be thrown at the theory can somehow be accommodated, then the theory is only superficially explaining things, but in fact it's not. And that goes certainly for Marxist theories of history. There is, they seem to be capable historically, ever since they've been proposed, to accommodate anything, no matter how superficially apparently contradictory to the theory. And the same, probably even worse, actually goes for Freudian psychoanalysis. String theory is an interesting one because, of course, string theorists would reject that characterization. But in fact, string theory is not a single theory. It is a large landscape of theories. You can change the basic parameters of the theory and you get a lot of other very closely related theories. And the last time I checked, the number of string theories out there is astronomical. It's like, into the millions. And so if that's the case, then of course string theory can accommodate anything, because all you need to do is to shift the parameters, tweak the parameters a little bit, and you'll be able to account for any kind of new evidence. If that's the case, and I am not positive because I'm not a fundamental physicist, so we would have to ask a physicist about this. But if that is the case, then yeah, that's a strong case for discarding string theory. If not as pseudoscience, certainly not as good science.
I'm just curious personally. So granted that for the moment, Marxism and psychoanalysis qualify as pseudoscience on your reading, do you personally find any value to them as theories? Any interest whatsoever?
That's a good question. I find value in what Marx and Freud wrote, which is not quite the same as finding value in the theories as they've been developed and then later by Marxists and Freudians, right? Excuse me.
So you find them more interesting in a sort of historical context, maybe the development of economics or the development of psychology, but less in the sense that they should be of any practical use to us now, or they should serve as any sort of guide for us when we think about how history, economics, or the mind actually function?
Right, correct. So Freud's great insight was that a lot of what's going on in human behavior is the result of subconscious processing of information, subconscious thinking, so things of which we're not aware. And that is still true. That's in fact empirically true. What is not empirically true is a bunch of the specifics that he came up with, the various syndromes that he described, the actual structure of this subconscious, and so on and so forth. Similarly with Marx, it is certainly the case that economics is important as an historical force. What is not the case is that it is the only or pervasive force that everything can be reduced to economics or to the struggle between classes. What is not true is that communism is the obvious end of history and that sort of stuff. Those things are out of the question as far as we can tell. But the fundamental insights, on the one hand, that economics is very important historically speaking, and on the other hand, that subconscious is very important psychologically speaking, yeah, those are there. Those are important.